Under the pale canopy of a cloudy Washington sky, Remy Wallace stood at the edge of his property, leaning against a rusted fence post, his gaze fixed on the sagging silhouette of the old barn. It had been there longer than anything else on the land, its timbers warped by time and rain, shingles missing like old teeth, the wood darkened by age but held together by something that went deeper than nails. The barn wasn't picturesque. It was not the kind of structure that appeared in real estate brochures or in the curated feeds of aspiring suburban photographers. But for Remy, it was something else entirely, a living record of stillness, of work done slowly, of things put away and never thrown out. It was the kind of a place you kept, not because it served a function, but because it bore witness. Remy had lived on the edge of development for 12 years. His home, a modest craftsman with peeling blue trim and overgrown hedges, sat on an acre and a half of land that had once been part of a family farm. Now, it bordered a brand-new HOA-controlled community called Deer Ridge Hollow, where cul-de-sacs bloomed like invasive plants and every front lawn looked like a copy of the last. Vinyl siding, gray garage doors, solar-powered garden lights that flickered on in unison at dusk like synchronized insects. The residents had been moving in gradually over the last year, most of them young couples with matching SUVs and contractor-installed trampolines. There had been little interaction between them and Remy, which suited him fine. He wasn't particularly unfriendly, but he didn't host barbecues, didn't wave from the mailbox, and didn't post welcome baskets on doorsteps. Instead, he worked. Restoration of antique pieces, wood, leather, metal. He specialized in the rare, the delicate, the misjudged. Things sent to him in silence from old estates, forgotten theaters, storage units found after death. His clients rarely knew the full value of what they were sending, only that they wanted it fixed, made whole, less strange. Sometimes he restored. Sometimes he preserved. Sometimes he simply documented an item's decay and boxed it back up for someone else to forget again. The barn served as his workspace and his storage vault. From the outside, it looked exactly like what people feared it might be: neglected, mysterious, inaccessible. Its doors were kept locked with thick chains and a weatherproof keypad, and Remy never let anyone inside. Not because there was danger, not because of secrets in the Hollywood sense, but because it was personal. The contents were part of a history he had never fully written down, a quiet museum of the human impulse to create and to destroy and to forget. Inside were mannequin forms from a collapsed German theater, sealed boxes of pre-war prosthetic limbs, cabinets filled with handwritten letters and journals from patients of closed sanatoriums, wax heads used in facial reconstruction training, wire and fabric birds from a forgotten taxidermy collection. Nothing illegal, nothing cursed, just fragments of human expression that had nowhere else to go. It wasn't until Karen Larson moved in that this peace began to erode. She was in her mid-50s, wore pastel athleisure, and had the clipped assertiveness of someone used to being both right and obeyed. She was elected HOA president before her boxes were even unpacked, and within weeks she had organized the first 3 community meetings, restructured the neighborhood website, and filed a complaint about the height of Remy's perimeter hedges. Her tone, in person, was always cheerfully firm, and she called him neighbor, with a smile that felt like a tight knot in the stomach. She never threatened, never raised her voice, but every word she spoke carried an edge of institutional authority, as if she'd been hired by the very concept of rules. She didn't like the barn. That much was obvious. She brought it up casually at first during an early morning walk, asked what it was used for, whether it had been inspected for termites, whether the wiring had been checked, whether there was any hazardous waste stored inside. Remy answered politely but briefly. It was his, it was private, it met code, and it wasn't her concern. But the questions continued. She took photos from the sidewalk, measured distances, asked city zoning for documentation, and then began circulating a rumor among the HOA board that something concerning was being stored inside. A vote was proposed to formally request an inspection, despite Remy's property not being under HOA jurisdiction. That detail didn't seem to matter much to Karen. During the third community meeting, which Remy did not attend, she referred to the barn as an unresolved issue and implied there might be biohazard concerns. Someone suggested animal hoarding. Another wondered aloud if he might be stockpiling junk for resale. Nobody said anything about the human instinct to fear what can't be categorized, or how silence is often mistaken for guilt. Instead, they nodded and formed a subcommittee. When a neighbor asked Karen what she really thought was inside, she smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes it's not about what's inside. It's about what it could become if no one pays attention." By the time Remy received the official letter taped to his gate citing community concern regarding non-conforming auxiliary structures, the mood had shifted. Something private had been made communal without his permission, and though he didn't know it yet, the barn would soon be more than a point of contention. It would be a battleground. On the last Thursday of September, under a curtain of mild rain and low-hanging clouds, Remy returned from a supply run to find a stack of orange warning placards staked into the edge of his property, right along the border where his driveway met the HOA-managed curb. The signs were printed with standard municipal language: pending inspection, private structure under review, environmental health assessment requested. But none bore an official seal. There was no city logo, no signature from a regulatory body, only the Deer Ridge Hollow HOA emblem in the top right corner, a pair of white antlers against a green field, vaguely pastoral and entirely invented. Below each notice, someone had neatly handwritten the date, the address, and a short line that read, "Non-member property under provisional oversight," per Article 12C of the Community Ordinance Packet. Remy stood in the drizzle for a long moment, staring at the signs without moving. Water collected on the shoulders of his jacket and trickled slowly down his sleeves. No one was in sight, though a few curtains in neighboring windows shifted slightly as he turned to look around. He didn't touch the signs. He didn't remove them. He simply walked up the long path to his porch, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside. That evening, the HOA website posted a notice announcing a community safety initiative, explaining that several properties, especially those bordering non-compliant parcels, would be subject to visual inspections and environmental consultation in the coming weeks. While the announcement never named Remy directly, it included a satellite image with a red circle drawn unmistakably around his barn. The site's comments section, which had previously been used for bake sale schedules and lost dog notices, filled quickly with speculation. Some users wondered if the barn was structurally unsafe. Others mused about mold, rot, or possible vermin infestation. One post, anonymous but suspiciously well-written, proposed that an unregulated storage space could pose unintended risks to collective well-being, and suggested that if HOA oversight was resisted, the matter might require municipal escalation. 2 days later, while Remy was unloading varnish and packaging from his truck, a white SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac, stopped just beyond his driveway, and idled for a full 5 minutes before a woman in a tan raincoat stepped out and approached, with a clipboard. She had the stiff, pleasant expression of someone who had memorized her script in the car. She introduced herself as Mallory Vintner, Environmental Compliance Liaison for Deer Ridge Hollow. She wasn't a city official, she clarified, just a volunteer, part of a new initiative. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but there was a tightness to the way she gripped the clipboard that suggested she would not leave until she had checked the appropriate boxes. She asked to inspect the barn. Remy declined. He told her the barn was structurally sound, that he had the original surveyor's certificate, and that her inspection was neither welcome nor legally enforceable. Mallory nodded, wrote something on her clipboard, and walked back to her SUV without argument. That night, someone unscrewed the solar lights along the walkway to his porch and laid them face down in the mud. A minor act, petty and quiet, but with unmistakable intent. The next morning, the garbage bins at the edge of his driveway were tipped over, their contents scattered across the gravel, torn open and damp from overnight mist. No raccoon had done it. The bags were sliced cleanly with something sharp. Over the next week, Remy's days became slower, more cautious. He noticed new cars parked at odd angles on the street near his house, unfamiliar silhouettes lingering by the sidewalk, sometimes scribbling notes or snapping photos with oversized phones. Every movement of his became public theater, every errand marked, every moment in the yard observed. At night, his motion lights clicked on with alarming regularity, though no animals triggered the camera. One morning, he found boot prints in the dew behind the barn, too large to be his own, too recent to dismiss. And then came the petition. A group of residents circulated a printed letter addressed to Remy, affixed with over 20 signatures from nearby homeowners. The tone was carefully measured but unmistakably hostile. It framed the barn as a concern not for aesthetics or property value, but for safety. It spoke of intergenerational residence, shared space harmony, and non-cooperative structures, suggesting that continued refusal to allow access for visual assessment might result in a collective legal recommendation. No deadline was given, no explicit threat, just a final line. In matters where the unknown intersects with the community, transparency is not just a courtesy, it is a responsibility. Remy didn't respond to the petition. He kept the letter, folded it once, and slid it into the drawer with old lease documents and workshop receipts. He had no intention of fighting them on their terms, not because he was afraid, but because he understood how bureaucratic aggression fed on acknowledgement. If you filed a counter-notice, they cited process. If you appealed, they called it escalation. If you ignored them, they grew anxious. 3 nights later, the fire came. It started around 2:20 a.m. A thin lick of flame, visible just behind the western wall of the barn, caught first on the exterior paneling, then spread rapidly along the dry joints in the roof beams. Remy was awake. He had taken to reading late at night, and he saw the orange flicker from his bedroom window before the smoke alarm even activated. By the time he reached the backyard, the corner of the barn was already engulfed, crackling like brittle parchment. The air smelled of burning lacquer and pine resin. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from the side of the house, knowing it would do nothing, but still tried. His boots sank in the wet grass. Sparks drifted like fireflies into the low trees beyond. He called 911. The dispatcher was calm, asked the right questions, sent a truck. By the time the firefighters arrived, 14 minutes after the call, the barn's roof had partially collapsed, and one wall had folded inward like wet cardboard. The flames were smothered within another 10 minutes, the skeleton left smoking and ruined. The fire captain took notes, asked routine questions. No, Remy didn't keep chemicals in the barn. No, there was no electrical wiring exposed. No, he hadn't been welding or using flammable agents recently. The official cause was left undetermined, though the captain gave him a long, sympathetic look when he said it. A crowd had gathered. Karen Larson was among them, dressed in a hooded fleece and soft moccasins, standing with 2 other HOA board members just behind the fire truck. Her hands were buried in her sleeves. She didn't approach. She just watched. Her face was difficult to read, but at one point, when a firefighter pulled free a half-burnt shipping crate and its contents tumbled into view, a half-melted ceramic mask, its mouth agape in stylized terror, Karen recoiled sharply, a hand flying too. Her chest. Someone heard her whisper something. Later, a neighbor would say she shrieked. Another said she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Whatever it was she saw, it silenced her. The next day, she filed a noise complaint about Remy's generator running during non-approved hours. It was petty. It was precise. But it came with a note, handwritten, not official, slipped under his front door. It read only 5 words in tight blue ink. I saw what was inside. Remy didn't react. He didn't post online, didn't speak to local reporters who came sniffing after seeing the smoke from the highway. He didn't explain what had burned, or what Karen had seen, or why she had reacted that way. He simply cleaned the site, salvaged what he could, and rebuilt the lock on his workshop door. Because the worst thing about a fire isn't what it destroys. It's what it reveals to people who never deserved to see. The days following the fire unfolded with a brittle calm, as though the neighborhood had collectively agreed not to speak too loudly around what had happened. Remy noticed how people paused when passing his house, how their steps slowed just slightly as they glanced toward the charred skeleton of the barn and then quickly away again, pretending not to look. The ruin stood for several days untouched, blackened ribs of timber jutting skyward, a dark mass at the edge of neatly trimmed lawns. When the autumn wind moved through it, the collapsed beams groaned faintly, like a dying breath drawn out too long. The rain had washed away the soot from the driveway, but the smell lingered, acrid, chemical, soaked into the earth. And beneath that smell, a different one entirely. The stubborn ghost of scorched leather, damp sawdust, the oil of things made and left behind. Remy worked in silence, restoring order as best he could. He cleared debris methodically, hauling the twisted remains of shelving, broken crates, warped frames into piles for sorting, what might be cleaned, what could be salvaged, and what would be burned again, this time with intention. He made no announcements and offered no explanations, but he was not alone in noticing what had gone missing. A week after the fire, the local waste management contractor left a note on his door requesting he not overload the residential pickup bin with hazard class materials. The implication was pointed. Someone had reported something. Yet, no official investigation followed, and the fire department had not returned. It was as if the matter had been quietly concluded, labeled accidental or unavoidable, filed and forgotten. Then came the letter. It arrived not by mail, but folded neatly and placed between the slats of his workshop window, halfway under the frame, where it had to be found by touch rather than sight. No return address, no signature, just a typewritten message on heavy paper. It began formally. The structural integrity of your remaining buildings has come under review by the Community Preservation Oversight Group. The name was new, some fresh HOA subcommittee, no doubt, and nowhere in the 3 dense paragraphs did it mention fire, damage, or recovery. Instead, it cited unverified restoration practices, accumulation of potentially volatile historical material, and elevated psychological impact risk on surrounding community, ending with a clause that he was to cease all workshop operations, pending cooperative reclassification. The language was so oblique and artificially polished that it read more like a press release than a notice. That evening his power flickered twice, briefly but noticeably. When it happened again the next night, Remy walked the perimeter of his property, checking every utility junction, breaker, and exposed line. He found nothing out of place until he reached the fence bordering Karen Larson's lot. There, tucked against the shared boundary near a half-dead shrub, was a small device. Square, black, barely larger than a matchbox with a blinking green diode and a twisted length of copper. It wasn't connected to anything directly, but it was buried, partially in soil, angled toward his house. He didn't recognize the model or purpose. It wasn't surveillance, at least not visibly, but it hummed when picked up, a faint vibration that seemed to disappear the moment he noticed it. He left it in the shed and made no comment. The next morning, a second anonymous letter arrived, this time slipped into his mailbox with surgical precision. A review of your property revealed multiple objects stored in contravention of aesthetic codes outlined in the Community Vision Docket, Section 4A. Attached was a blurry, zoomed-in photograph of a wooden crate with faint markings, Gothic script, almost unreadable, partially exposed under a tarp. It was a box Remy hadn't moved since before the fire, one he had left at the edge of the cleared site because its contents had not survived the heat. How the photo was taken and from what angle was unclear. The image was too tight, too specific, as though the camera had been placed inches from the subject. But no one had entered his yard. No cameras had triggered. The tarp had not been disturbed. He checked his own equipment that night. Every lens, every sensor, every trigger. Nothing tampered with, no footage missing, no strange gaps. But still the certainty weighed on him. Someone had seen something up close, not just watched him from a distance, but entered the perimeter unseen. Someone had walked the same path he did, waited in the same shadows. And then the dog came. It wasn't his, nor any neighbor's that he knew. A rangy brindle mutt, cautious but not feral, appeared at the edge of the burned site one morning and sat silently among the wreckage. Remy approached slowly, offering a palm. The dog didn't flinch. Its fur was matted, dusted with soot as if it had been sleeping in ash. Around its neck, fastened with wire instead of a proper collar, was a makeshift tag made of metal scrap, an old can lid, crudely etched with letters that read, "We see you." Remy knelt beside the dog and stared at the tag, unblinking, unmoving. The animal did not run. He removed the wire, let the tag fall to the ground, and carried the dog inside. That same evening, HOA flyers appeared on doors along the block, announcing a new community task force, Project Uniformity. The stated goal was to harmonize outlier properties with neighborhood values through active observation and structured encouragement. The language was cleaner than before, stripped of its earlier bureaucratic complexity, as if they'd finally decided to stop pretending. The message was clear. Non-conforming elements would be dealt with. The community, or the illusion of one, had become a weapon. 2 days later, a low thump echoed from his front porch just before sunrise. He opened the door to find a plastic bag left in the dark, weighted with something soft and cold. Inside was a stack of photographs, printed on glossy paper. Most were of the barn before the fire, angled shots from impossible positions, including one from above, as if taken from a drone hovering 20 feet up. One image showed Remy through the workshop window, his face partially lit by lamplight, head bowed over a restoration piece. Another captured a moment of him with a gloved hand inside a wooden crate, partially obscured by shadows. At the bottom of the stack, a final photo. The dog, asleep on his porch. He stood there for a long time, holding the bag in one hand, the weight of the images colder than the autumn air. Across the street, he saw Karen watering her plants. She didn't look up. She never looked up anymore. The escalation was no longer symbolic. Whatever fear had gripped Karen during the fire had turned to something else, something methodical. She wasn't afraid of what she'd seen. She was afraid of what it made her feel, and she had decided to destroy that feeling before it spread. That night, Remy pulled down the blackout curtains in his workshop and covered every window with copper mesh. He disconnected his router, shut off the cameras, and took his work into the basement for the first time in years. He didn't want protection. He wanted silence. Because he understood now. What had started as neighborhood tension had become something closer to ritual. Not conspiracy, not crime, but a performance of control meant to strip his space of mystery, to drag it into the center of the cul-de-sac and flatten it under collective interpretation. And they would keep coming. Not with torches or lawsuits, not with fists, but with rules and lenses and words like compliance and safety and belonging. They would come until there was nothing left but sameness and apology, unless he made them stop, not by arguing, not by explaining, but by holding the line long enough for the ugliness underneath their unity to turn on itself. Because that's what Karen never understood. It wasn't what was inside the barn that disturbed her. It was that something could still remain unknown. The sky had turned that pale, diluted blue that only appears on cold October afternoons when the sun has no strength left and shadows stretch longer than they should. It was the kind of day that passed without urgency, where the wind moved sideways through bare branches and every noise felt further away than it really was. In the stillness of it, the neighborhood looked immaculate. Lawns trimmed to military precision, porches dusted clean, Halloween decorations arranged at perfect angles as though fear itself had been rendered decorative, plastic, something bought in, bulk and stapled to a wall. Yet, under all that balance there was tension, like a tight wire humming beneath the soil. Remy felt it in the way people paused at intersections, in how car doors shut a little too softly, in the way the kids didn't play past dusk anymore. He had stopped waving back to anyone weeks ago, and they had, collectively, stopped pretending he was part of the neighborhood. Inside his workshop, what was left of it, Remy was assembling what he thought of as the last of the patient pieces. It was an antique automaton, part of a once elegant mechanical theater from a defunct asylum that had been housed in New Jersey in the 1940s. The figure was a seated boy, arms jointed with brass hinges, head disproportionately large for its torso, cheeks slightly puffed as if mid-laughter or breath. Its mouth opened in a mechanical rhythm when wound, and the internal box produced distorted versions of lullabies in broken German. The piece had survived the fire only because it had been sealed in a metal crate, buried under collapsed shelving. Now, as Remy realigned its wiring and adjusted the cracked porcelain of its face, he felt a rare, precise focus, one that drowned out the outside world like a curtain drawn over a hospital window. That illusion didn't last. It was early evening when the sound came. Not a knock, but the dull resonance of something thudding softly against his front door. He opened it to find a manila envelope propped upright, tied with twine. No stamp, no address, only his name printed in neat block letters. Inside were 9 documents, copies of permits, building surveys, HOA boundary claims, and annotated maps of the neighborhood, each marked with color-coded sections indicating utility access points, drainage paths, and an array of alleged violations. What made it worse was the inclusion of a small folded printout from the Deer Ridge Hollow Incident Monitoring Committee, a group he hadn't known existed until that moment. The page detailed a timeline of atypical behaviors observed at his address, listing things like excessive nocturnal activity, non-conforming restoration practices, presence of unregistered animals, and failure to attend community integrative events. At the bottom, a signature, Karen L., Community Oversight Lead, and a note in pen. This is an opportunity to clarify your role in our neighborhood. Please consider attending the mediation session scheduled for Thursday evening. Refusal will be interpreted as conscious obstruction. He didn't consider going. He went, not out of compliance or concession, but because the accumulation of indirect pressure had become its own language, and Remy had decided it was time to speak back in theirs. He arrived at the community hall precisely at 7 p.m., dressed in his oldest work coat, boots still carrying streaks of ash from his last burn pile, and hair damp from the mist that clung to everything this time of year. Inside, the space was arranged with passive hostility. Folding chairs in uneven rows, a projector screen lowered, and a long table at the front where Karen and 2 other board members sat in neutral-toned cardigans and sharp, practiced smiles. The air smelled like weak coffee and industrial carpet. Karen rose as he entered, gestured to a seat near the front. "We're grateful you could join us, Remy," she said, as if reading from a script. This is meant to be a constructive conversation." He didn't answer. He sat. What followed was less a dialogue and more a choreographed reprimand. A slideshow began, filled with aerial photos of his property, time-stamped entries from neighborhood apps, and paraphrased concerns from residents. None named directly, but all clearly orchestrated. They showed close-ups of burned lumber, cracked plaster, items in transit, photos clearly taken from inside his lot. There was even one blurry image of the automaton boy, mid-disassembly, its eye sockets empty, looking more like a crime scene than art. "We understand that your work is unique," Karen said after the presentation, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "But uniqueness can sometimes be misunderstood when it's kept in isolation. This neighborhood thrives on transparency, and unfortunately, secrecy creates fear." She paused, her voice carefully modulated. "This is not about punishing you. It's about inviting you to reconsider your role as a steward of community values." Remy sat quietly for a moment, then leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry without force. "You lit my barn on fire," he said, not as an accusation but as a statement of weather. "Or someone did. You all know it. You were there. You watched it burn, and now you want me to agree that it was for the best. But I won't." A flicker of discomfort crossed Karen's face, subtle but real. She glanced at the others, then replied, "No one is accusing you. That fire was ruled inconclusive, but I believe it was a warning, for all of us, about how dangerous division can become when it goes unaddressed." He stood then, not abruptly, but with the finality of someone who'd read the ending of a story twice just to make sure. "I don't belong to your division," he said, "and I'm not here to be mended or processed. You don't know what I keep, and you don't want to. That's the truth that's eating at you. You saw something you didn't understand, and instead of asking, you tried to destroy it. And now you're trying to write a version of the story where I asked for your help. I didn't." He walked out, leaving silence in his wake. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the flagpoles near the parking lot. A group of teens stood near the bike racks, their voices low and indistinct. One of them wore a hoodie that read, "Dear Ridge Lives Clean," the slogan printed in looping cursive like it was meant for a detergent ad. That night, as Remy sat at his desk with the automaton laid open before him, he heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from the broken music box embedded in the figure's chest. It hadn't worked in years. He hadn't repaired the sound mechanism yet, but the machine was pulsing with low vibration, like a heartbeat slowed to near silence. He leaned close, pressed a hand to its shell. The sound grew clearer. Not words, not music, just presence. Something returned to life, not through restoration, but through attention. The next day, he found another note. Taped to his mailbox, folded into a triangle, the message was brief. "We regret your refusal to participate. Final steps will be taken to ensure communal continuity. Please prepare accordingly." No signature this time, no polite phrasing, just a warning wrapped in bureaucracy, a notification pretending not to be a threat. And yet, Remy felt no fear. What replaced it was closer to resolve, because now he knew their limits. He had looked them in the face, sat under their fluorescent lights, heard their language twisted into something sterile and strange. They wanted purity. They wanted sameness. They wanted to reduce everything strange to a category, to convert it into something that could be taxed, surveilled, or explained away with smiling diplomacy. But there were still things they couldn't reach, still remnants of the world that resisted simplification. His work was not a business. It was memory bound in object and intention, and it did not belong to them. The automaton breathed on his shelf. The soot clung to the grass, and Karen, in all her precision, had already seen too much to go back to who she was before. The fire had not destroyed the mystery. It had only scattered it. And now it was everywhere. By the time November sank its weight fully into the town, the trees had shed nearly every leaf, leaving the streets bare and skeletal, as though the neighborhood had been stripped down to its structure. The air was colder now, dry and thin like paper, and sounds traveled differently, crisper, closer, as if the walls had drawn inward. The residents of Deer Ridge Hollow began to decorate for winter early, eager to overwrite the tension of the fall with strings of white lights and synthetic wreaths on doors. Inflatable snowmen appeared on lawns, smiling through motors that buzzed faintly in the quiet. The veneer of festivity stretched across the neighborhood like gauze across an open wound. But Remy's property remained unchanged. No lights, no garlands, no signs of seasonal cheer, only the slow repair of a world they had tried to burn. He no longer worked in full daylight. Most of his efforts took place in the hours just before dawn or late at night, when the motion lights had long stopped flashing and the distant thump of passing cars fell silent beneath the breath of wind. He had moved his tools into the basement, which hadn't been used for years, a space more cave than room, lined with stone and still air. The automaton boy sat near the far wall, partially reassembled, surrounded by fragments of other rescued figures. Glass eyes in velvet-lined trays, leather limbs with cracked seams, miniature organs made from twisted copper and horsehair. The work had become slower, more careful. There was no urgency in completion, only a ritual of preservation. But even in this withdrawn stillness, the outside kept pushing in. It started with the noise. 3 nights after the note appeared, Remy was awakened by a low, vibrating hum, like a generator just outside the walls. He rose in darkness and followed the sound to the front of the house, where he stood barefoot on cold floorboards, staring through the side window. At first, he saw nothing, but then his eyes adjusted to the movement. 3 figures near the remains of the barn, crouched low, their shapes barely visible against the patchy moonlight. They moved with quiet coordination, one unrolling something from a canvas case, another holding a long, tubular tool that glinted sharply in the dark. The third planted a stake in the ground near the southeast corner of the lot, then stepped back and waved a small device in an arc over the area, as if scanning it. No words were spoken, only the hum and the occasional chirp of a locator ping. Remy watched without moving. He didn't turn on the lights, he didn't call the police, he simply memorized the way they moved, efficient, silent, like contractors accustomed to being unnoticed. The job was finished within minutes. When they left, they did so without looking back, disappearing down the street into a black SUV that rolled away without headlights. In the morning, the ground where they had worked was flat and undisturbed, save for a faint patch of disturbed soil and the shimmer of something reflective just beneath the dirt. He didn't touch it. He marked the location and returned to the house. That afternoon, Karen made her first direct contact in over a week. She stood at the base of his front steps, holding a sealed document in one hand and a reusable shopping bag in the other. Her smile was tight, her posture straighter than usual, and her eyes darted quickly between the porch and the road, as if unsure whether she was being watched. "Remy," she said, in that practiced voice that belonged more to real estate showings than confrontation. "We need to have one last conversation. Just us." He didn't answer, but the door stayed open, which she took as permission. She set the bag down on the steps and held out the document. "This is a notice of community incompatibility. It's not legal, not yet, but it's persuasive. If we submit it to the zoning board, and if they agree, it starts a process. One that ends with you losing the right to maintain a non-conforming structure here. They'll use code enforcement, safety standards, environmental justifications. There are always loopholes." Remy looked at the envelope, then back to her face. She didn't flinch. "I came to offer you an option," she continued. "If you sign this addendum, we'll withdraw the complaint." You'll agree to sell the property within 6 months to a pre-approved buyer. You'll be compensated generously, and you can take whatever installations you want with you. No questions asked. She nudged the bag forward with her foot. I brought something I thought might help you decide. Remy opened it. Inside was a piece from his collection, one he had assumed was destroyed in the fire. A wooden bust of a woman's face, carved with an uncanny symmetry, the kind found in 19th century spiritualist sculptures. Its eyes were closed, lips parted slightly, hair curled back in heavy waves, but what made it distinct was the signature on the base, a name known only to 3 people in the country. The piece had not been in the barn at the time of the fire. He had stored it in the crawlspace beneath his kitchen. Karen must have seen something change in his expression because she stepped back. You should know we're trying to protect you. These things you keep, they're too heavy for a neighborhood like this. You're not a danger, but people will make you one if they don't understand. This is your chance to leave with dignity. Then, for the first time, her voice faltered. What I saw that night, whatever that thing was, I still dream about it. Not because it scared me. Because it knew I was there. That's not right, Remy. Things like that shouldn't be alive in places like this. She turned and left without waiting for an answer. That evening, the lights in his house surged and dimmed 4 times in succession. His breaker box, checked meticulously, showed no fault. But outside, in the patch of disturbed soil behind the barn, a faint blue glow pulsed beneath the earth, like the last breath of something sleeping. Remy dug down with a gloved hand until his fingers struck metal. The object was rectangular, smooth, warm to the touch. He unearthed it carefully, revealing what looked like a sealed canister no larger than a paperback book, with an interface panel and no markings beyond a single embossed phrase, "Calibration in progress." He took it inside and locked it away, though. The glow never ceased. It throbbed quietly through the container, lighting the corners of the room with a faint, rhythmic pulse. That night, he did not sleep. Instead, he returned to the basement and began the careful assembly of something he hadn't touched in years, a containment cradle, originally built for transporting unstable kinetic sculptures. It was meant to absorb vibration, dampen pressure, and regulate temperature. It was also lined with a rare alloy used in shielding signal interference, an old investment for a forgotten commission. He placed the glowing object within it and sealed it shut. The next morning, he found the final notice, printed on thick cardstock, laminated, and mounted on a stake driven into his front yard. Effective immediately. Property designated non-compliant. Final measures authorized by majority HOA vote. Beneath it, a row of red tags had been affixed to the chain-link fence, electrical hazard warnings, sanitation alerts, mold exposure claims. None of them true. All of them credible enough to warrant intervention. The message was clear. They were coming again. But this time, he was ready. Not to fight, not to argue, but to open the doors they were so desperate to seal. Because they thought they feared what he stored. They had no idea what he had preserved. The wind that morning arrived early, cutting through the thin light before the sun could rise, howling softly between fence slats and bending the brittle grass under invisible pressure. There was a weight in the air, not just the shift of weather, but something older, more deliberate, like the pressure that settles in a room just before a door creaks open on its own. Remy stood at the edge of what had once been his barn, now reduced to scorched foundation and blackened soil, holding the notice in one hand and a rusted wrench in the other. The red tags on the fence flapped like small flags in the wind, symbols of a war already in progress, declarations made by those who believed their paperwork could cleanse history itself. But the time for concealment had ended. They had pried too deep, broken too much, and forced into light the one thing they could never make safe: mystery. That morning, Remy did not retreat into his basement. He did not seal the door or lower the blackout curtains or pretend silence could shield him. He opened the basement hatch wide, pulled the containment cradle into daylight, and placed it in the center of the ruined barn site where the sun would eventually strike it first. The glow from within the alloy casing pulsed softly through the mesh, flickering faster now, as if in anticipation. By noon, the trucks arrived. 3 white vehicles, unmarked but new, with amber lights that rotated silently atop their roofs. Men in gray uniforms stepped out with calm, clinical precision, each holding a clipboard or a handheld scanner, their expressions unreadable. One approached the porch and requested access for immediate code enforcement operations. Remy said nothing, only stepped aside. They were not police. They had no warrant, but they had authority of a different kind, the illusion of structure. Behind them came Karen, her hair tightly pulled back, a scarf wound too deliberately around her throat, and a face that had long since shed its attempt at friendliness. She didn't speak as she passed him. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the crate. The inspectors fanned out. One took soil samples from near the foundation. Another scanned the exterior of the house with a thermal device. A third descended toward the basement. But the moment he stepped over the threshold, he paused. The air inside had changed. Denser, warmer, humming faintly as though the walls themselves had developed breath. He looked back at Karen, uncertain. She nodded once, and he continued. Outside, a small crowd had gathered along the sidewalk. Not neighbors exactly, at least not in the personal sense, but members of the community. They stood in tight clusters, some with folded arms, others with phones out, not recording but gripping them like talismans. Their expressions were unreadable, caught between curiosity and fear, excitement and doubt. None spoke above a murmur. They watched as one of the uniformed men opened the containment cradle, exposing the source of the glow for the first time since it had been unearthed. A single breath passed through the crowd as the object inside stirred, not visibly, not with movement, but with vibration, a resonance that could be felt more than heard, like the low hum before a symphony begins. Karen stepped forward then, her voice sharp and rehearsed. She began to list violations, terms like unlicensed storage of hazardous material, refusal to comply with community integration policy, environmental destabilization risk. Her words were orderly, delivered with the force of certainty. But halfway through her statement, the object changed. The glow deepened, shifted hue, and the hum became sound. Not words, not melody, but something resembling breath, echoing across the yard like the low sigh of someone waking up. One of the inspectors stumbled backward. Another dropped his scanner. And then came the voice. Not from the crate, not from the object, but from the automaton boy, which had been placed near the house hours before, as if watching. Its porcelain lips parted slowly, mechanically, and from its chest came a garbled phrase in fractured English, the same phrase repeated twice before its mouth froze again. "You are not keeper. You are not keeper." The crowd went silent. Karen stepped back, her expression stiffening. Her eyes were locked not on the automaton but on the opened crate, her throat working as she tried to speak and failed. Her fingers trembled. For a moment she seemed very small, just a woman in a coat, surrounded by strangers, staring at something she had demanded be uncovered. Something in her broke then. Not visibly, not theatrically, but in the quiet way that people fracture under the weight of something that confirms their worst suspicion, that they were never in control. Remy stepped forward, past the officials, past the hushed neighbors, and stood beside the object. "You wanted to know what was inside," he said quietly. "You wanted to define it, sanitize it, remove the pieces that didn't fit. But this wasn't built for you. It's not here to comfort or entertain or obey. It remembers. That's all it does." Karen tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. She turned to leave, but one of the inspectors blocked her path. Unintentionally, perhaps, but she stopped short as if the gesture had physical weight. She looked around at the faces now watching her, not with fear or support, but with something worse: neutrality. No one moved to her defense. No one argued with Remy. They simply observed, as though some deep part of them understood what had happened, even if their minds hadn't caught up. A light rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. The crate closed on its own, its glow fading beneath the alloy shell. The automaton made no further sound. The officials packed up their equipment in silence. One muttered something into a headset and received no reply. No citations were issued, no fines delivered, and when the trucks left they did so slowly, without urgency, like men who had touched something they didn't understand and hoped it wouldn't follow them home. Karen left that afternoon. Not loudly, not ceremoniously. She returned to her house, gathered what she could in 2 small suitcases, and was gone before evening. Her name was never spoken at another HOA meeting. Her property was listed for sale 2 weeks later. The community board quietly disbanded by the end of the season. Remy returned the object to the basement. He sealed the cradle again. But he left the door open, not out of defiance, but as a reminder. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Some are meant to endure. Winter settled slowly over the neighborhood, not with storms or sudden cold, but with a persistent stillness that blanketed the streets like a held breath. The wreaths came down later than usual that year, and fewer lights were strung along the eaves of identical houses. People still waved, still walked their dogs and trimmed their hedges, but there was a different rhythm now, more deliberate, more watchful, as if some part of the unspoken order had been quietly dismantled and no one dared name what replaced it. Remy's property remained untouched by decor, yet no new notices appeared, no committees gathered, and the red tags on his fence were never replaced. He removed them one morning in silence and tossed them into the fire pit out back, where they curled and blackened in the flame without resistance. He still worked, though not as often, and not always with the same intensity. The pieces he restored now were smaller, more intricate, less about preservation and more about understanding. The automaton sat still in the corner of the basement, its mechanism dormant, its face calm. The glowing object remained sealed, resting where it had been returned, silent but not forgotten. At times, in the middle of the night, he would think he heard its faint pulse through the floorboards like the slow heartbeat of a buried idea that refuses to die. But it didn't call for him. It didn't need to. Karen's house stood empty for months, until a family with no visible affiliation to the HOA moved in. Quiet people, a middle-aged couple with an older father who tended the lawn with calm, deliberate care. They never asked Remy about the barn, or the fire, or the strange night that had passed like a fever dream through their neighborhood. When their dog wandered onto his property once and sat near the automaton, they called it back gently and waved. He waved back. No further words were exchanged. That was enough. Nothing grand happened in the wake of it. No revelations, no reckonings, just the slow reversion to something quieter and older. But the land felt different. The silence that once choked now breathed. And for the first time in years, Remy didn't feel like a relic being tolerated. He felt like part of something unspoken, something that had outlived bureaucracy and opinion, something waiting to be remembered but on its own terms.